Welcome to BDI Briefs, where we take a brief look at important issues about the emotional side of diabetes. Thanks for joining us today. I'm here with Dr. Bill Polonsky, president of the Behavioral Diabetes Institute, and Dr. Susan Guzman, director of clinical education at the Behavioral Diabetes Institute. Both are world-renowned diabetes psychologists and two of my favorite people to talk with. My name is Scott Johnson. I've lived with diabetes for almost 45 years and have been active in the diabetes social media space and industry for a long time. And with introductions out of the way, Bill, what are we talking about today?
Thanks, Scott. Well, there's a brand new study that came out that I wanted to tell you about because I think it highlights something very important that everyone should know about. You can see on this first slide the title of this manuscript, which is, I'll read it with you, Personalized Patient Data and Behavioral Nudges to Improve Adherence to Chronic Cardiovascular Medications. It's a randomized trial. I should mention, this was not just people with diabetes. This is people with any cardiovascular condition. And more importantly, with anybody who was taking chronic cardiovascular medication. So it could be diabetes medications, it could be blood pressure medications, it could be cholesterol medications. And what they did is they said, let's find a whole big group of folks who, from either they have type 2 diabetes or they have these other conditions, they have some issue. And in this case, they were saying they've had some slip or they haven't refilled their medications recently, in the past week or so. And let's see what happens if we start sending them different kinds of reminder text messages. Well, text messages help people to stick with their medications over the course of time. And they looked over the course of, if I remember correctly, a year. And these were done through 3 big healthcare systems in Colorado. And they included a lot of people. In fact, the study involved more than 9,000 people. And what they did is they divided these people up and they randomized them into one of 4 groups. So each group received a different kind of text message. And you can see on this slide what those 4 text messages are. I've taken this from the actual publication. So one was people got just sort of a generic reminder text message like, hey, you forgot, get your medications filled. The second was something that was more than that, it was more of a behavioral nudge about how you could refill the medication, try to remind yourself, again, using some of the behavioral techniques that many of us as psychologists are familiar with. The third group got that same behavioral nudge text, plus there was what they call a fixed message chatbot that you could use to address some of the barriers to medication adherence that people might have, but it wasn't interactive. It was just like, here's a couple common reasons why you might be missing, and et cetera. And to tell you the truth, I don't remember the details of this. So if you're one of the authors, I'm sorry for getting this wrong. And then the last group got nothing, no text messages at all. So again, they followed these people over the course of 1 year. And the question they asked was, which of these groups did better in terms of improving medication adherence over time? And what you can see on this next slide is really the most important table they had, the important figure they had that showed their results. And if you look all the way on the right side of your screen, you can see there's 4 groups and there's 4 lines, and you'll notice you can't really tell those 4 circles apart. And that's important. And the reason you can't tell them apart is because there's no difference about them at all. None. So what do we conclude about that? Well, let's read what they had to say from their discussion. And this is what it reads. I'll read it with you. The objective of the study was to assess the effectiveness of different text message reminders to improve medication refill adherence. In a pragmatic trial with high patient enrollment, including patients traditionally underrepresented in clinical trials, almost half of the people in the study were Hispanic, and very few opted out, they found that by the end of the study, medication adherence was still low. And they used a particular way of measuring how well people were, like adherence is a terrible word, I know Susan will correct us, it's how well they were picking up the medications they needed for their pharmacy that matched what had been recommended that they take. And our best evidence suggests that if you can get to, well, 100% is great, but you can get to 80%, that's pretty darn good. And we call that success. But this group, even after a year of these text messages was at 60%. So I'm going to read the rest of this now. It says, text message reminders were not effective in improving refill adherence at 12 months, regardless of the type of message. Not generic reminders, not behavioral nudges, and chatbots. There were no differences also in any kind of clinical events like hypoglycemia or people ending up in the hospital across the study groups. In other words, these guys did a great study, very carefully done, and they showed that these different kinds of text messages didn't work. And, well, I think that's fabulous. I mean, it's really an amazing and interesting result. And we've seen similar kinds of studies like this with similar kinds of what we call disappointing outcomes. And the reason we believe this is disappointing, Susan and I have done a lot of programs on this, is because it doesn't address the real reason that people tend to forget, miss, avoid medication usage over the course of time, especially these chronic cardiovascular medications. And it can't address some of the real reasons, like I can't afford these medications, or I'm not sure these medications are good for me. I feel kind of iffy about it. I've heard about these scary side effects. I'm not really sure they accomplish anything. But it's not people are just forgetful and we just keep reminding them. It's we need to spend time and hang out with each person and say, what creeps you out about taking this med? Odds are good you feel, well, mixed about it. And let's appreciate the ways people think about their meds, what they've heard about, what they've learned, the emotional side of this. And that's when you can really have an enormous impact on helping people be successful and get, well, enthused about getting on board on this idea of doing a better job with medication, taking over the course of time, which we know in turn is by far one of the most important things you can do to help people get to a safe place with their, well, blood sugar, their blood pressure, lipids, and more. So again, I think this study is just a good reminder of how we have to stop blaming people if they're not taking their medications as recommended, to not just think, oh, they forgot again, I should just keep reminding them and bugging them, and take the time just to ask people, how do you think about these medications? That's what's missing. What worries you about it? What benefits do you see or not? Can you afford your medications? And once we do that, that's when we can really help people. So I turn over to my colleagues. Susan, Scott, how does this make sense or not make sense to you?
I do think it makes sense to me in that, as with many of the points you bring up, it's all about starting a discussion, right? You get some indications about one thing or another, and you need to dig a little bit deeper and find out what's really going on with people and why they might not be refilling their medications. I also think about all of the obstacles that are often in the way for me in refilling a prescription. And it's often, there's a level of overhead involved in that. And it's, maybe phone calls or messages to my insurance company and to the doctor's office, and then the actual pharmacy. And there's so many hands involved in the transaction. And oftentimes they're all pointing at each other like, oh, we didn't get this request, or you need to do X, Y, Z. And so there's all of that involved. And I can just think, if I'm not convinced that the medication is doing something beneficial for me, or if I'm experiencing some side effects that I'm having trouble dealing with, it can all be just a bit much. And I could easily see how people would not continue refilling their medications. So again, this makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you alluded to, Bill, I think that part of the challenge is the whole concept of adherence. It was meant to replace compliance. As I tell you to do this, and you either do it or you don't. If you don't, you're non-compliant. Adherence was meant to be a conversation that the person and the patient and the healthcare professional decide on the treatment plan together, and that was meant to be the behavior that was recommended. But instead, adherence became kind of a replacement for compliance, and there isn't that agreement. And I think that medication adherence in particular really minimizes the complexity around the decision around medication taking as a behavior. And in this study, it was specifically around the behavior of refilling a prescription. And what we learned is, at least for these folks, it was not about forgetting. And as you said, Bill, it misses sort of the complex conversation that may be required to what the real barriers are. And if we look at it as a behavior, a complex behavior, then we're more likely to see what are the person's good reasons, and how can I help them increase their perception of benefits and address their obstacles, which is how we know people may make some changes that can really have a powerful impact on their health.
Sure. Thank you for saying all that. And by the way, as AI moves forward, I haven't given up on this idea that maybe there will be a way of doing this online for folks, an AI chatbot kind of approach that could be so powerful, but it really needs to focus on these critical issues and to sort of open the door to not what we think is wrong, what people are doing, but how they're thinking and feeling about their meds, and making that an important conversation that can make a difference. Anyway, I don't want to belabor it. I think you kind of said it well, and I think that's probably pretty good. So Scott, take us on.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, there's tremendous value in knowing through this study that it's not about forgetting. It's, we can cross that off of our list of things we need to address there. So there's a lot of value in that.
Sometimes it's about forgetting, just to be clear. Sometimes it really is about forgetting. We just can't think it's always about forgetting, because there's what we call motivated forgetting. There's good reasons to be forgetting anytime. If you don't think it's very important or useful. And sometimes it's not. But that we shouldn't be overly focused on that's probably what it is for everybody.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. I appreciate that. All right. Well, big thanks to... Yeah. Right. Yeah. Big thanks to everyone watching. And as always, big thanks to you two for just bringing this topic up so that we can talk about it, the value of conversations and digging in to learn more about it. And it's refreshing. And I also include this in positive news, right? It's research happening in a very important aspect of living well with diabetes. So thank you. And I'm excited to share more in our next episode. We'll see you then.